Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, we are getting back into Supergirl Infected, which is to say Supergirl who is infected, like the Supergirl who laughs, versus Batman and Superman. This is kind of nuts. But first things first, I do want to let you guys know that we have been dumping a whole lot of full stories recently, like making like mega full stories and different things like that. We did a whole bunch of full story videos with the individual story arcs from Green Lantern, but I want to start ramping up and covering Green Lantern again. So what we're going to do here is in the next couple days, we're going to take all the full stories we've done and combine them into like a mega full story. The people on Patreon already have it. They got it a few days early, but it's basically going to be like this 9-hour Green Lantern video. It's the longest full story video we've done. I'm curious to see how people respond to 9 hours. Like what I want to do, I want to max out the YouTube upload, right? The most you can upload to YouTube is 128 gigabytes. I want to see if we can do that. Like I want to see if we can like exceed that. I feel like it would end up being like a 15-hour long video, but I'm curious if you guys are going to watch 9 hours of Green Lantern. It's kind of nuts, right? Like that's an insane amount of content. But yeah, so getting into this, in the last video, we basically talked about how the Supergirl, how Supergirl herself had actually intercepted a batarang that was meant for Superman to turn him into the Superman who laughs, and the result was that she was infected instead. This is kind of cool, right? Because this feels a lot. I don't know how many of you guys remember this far back, but it feels a lot like the the Red Lantern Supergirl, and DC does that, right? You know, a little bit of exposition here, a little bit of explanation. DC does that with Supergirl. Kara Zor-El is one of these characters where she's been popular, but only under certain circumstances, right? The original run of her character was incredibly popular, right? Like the original Supergirl who was a backup feature in the Action comic stories, and then eventually got her own solo feature in the Adventure comic stories. She was really, really popular, right? But that was all before Crisis on Infinite Earths. The issue was that after Crisis happened, Superman went back to being the status quo of the last survivor of Krypton, right? And he couldn't be the last survivor of Krypton, like the last son of Krypton, if there was like another Kryptonian out there. So they ended up kind of getting like this weird other dimensional version, some kind of shape-shifting, manifesting thing that basically became the new Supergirl. It wasn't really the same. And then eventually Kara Zor-El returned when DC was like, whatever, just bring her back, who cares? And fans enjoyed it. But it's one of these things where like people don't really read her stories all the time. But if it's something kind of kooky and exotic that happens to her, like she becomes a Red Lantern or becomes the Supergirl who laughs, then people are really interested, right? And a lot of that's rooted back to the fact that during the Crisis on Infinite Earths story, she was more powerful than Superman, right? It was one of those things that DC had kind of hit on periodically for a while, and then basically confirmed during the Crisis story. But this basically picks up with her kind of looking around after she's become the Supergirl who laughs, and then just sort of kind of taking on this stance of like, she's truly going to fix the world and she's truly going to make the world a better place. Now, here's the thing. Jody Houser's writing sometimes is really, really good. And other times it's kind of like, I'm not really sure where she's going with this. But I do love what she's doing here, right? Because when it comes to the various Kryptonians that exist in DC Comics, they always pull their punches, right? We've seen that happen multiple times, and it's been confirmed multiple times over the course of DC Comics that Superman pulls his punches. That if we saw Superman fight like outright with all the strength that he potentially has, he could potentially destroy the world, right? The cool thing about this is that her showing up and basically doing things like rescuing a bus and so on and so forth, one of the things that you kind of notice here is that she's kind of become the darker version of herself. Not really evil, but almost really just kind of like obsessed with herself, and so far as like, I'm the most important thing ever. And this manifests in the form of like, yes, this bus is saved, but instead of like tending to the passengers and doing what we would expect her to do, which is to say, is anybody okay? Is everybody all right? Instead, she's just like, you're welcome. I've done a fine job. And she like pats herself on the back and then goes about her business and does her thing. And that's the kind of crazy situation, is because she immediately goes after the bus driver, right? And the response here is like, these kids almost died, and it was almost because of you, right? There's no questions of like, what happened here? You know, did a tire blow out? Like were you drinking on the job? Like none of those questions were asked. It's immediately the assumption that like this guy screwed up and like he now has to pay the price, right? It's a very heavy-handed approach, but it's almost kind of a criticism of like, I know what's right 100% of the time, right? Kind of adopted that mentality. What is it? Philip DeFranco said, why be informed when you have your opinion? It's that kind of concept sort of thrown into the comic insofar as she's just sort of she's carried away with herself. Now, the good thing about this is that Jody Houser strikes a balance. It'd be very, very easy to kind of go down like the hardcore political scene, but we get just enough to where it's like, okay, so she's basically become super arrogant and super self-obsessed, but not so much where it's like, all right, now I'm reading a political message. If it's done right, political message messages can be amazing. A really good example of that, God Loves, Man Kills. If it's not really good, well, then you basically get the first 2 years of Marvel after All New, All Different. So, you know, the cool thing about this is that, of course, Superman shows up here, and this is where things begin to shift. Because again, for anybody who'd been reading Supergirl for any real measure of time, the first thing they'll tell you is that during the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, she was the last one standing, right? All the versions of Superman, including Superboy Prime, all those guys had fallen, and she was the only one left who was powerful enough to do really any kind of damage or really even stand a chance against the Anti-Monitor. Now, she didn't save everything, right? That all basically came down to the Spectre, but at the end of the day, she basically outlasted everybody else. And people kind of look to that as the perspective of she's stronger than Superman. When you take that and you couple it with a lot of the things we've seen confirmed along the way, between the time that she reappeared, you know, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, going into like New 52 and DC Universe Rebirth and that kind of a thing, that she's just this really heavy hitter. And that's kind of what goes on here, is because she basically tells Superman, like, you're a half measure, right? Like, you could fix the world. You could punish the criminals. Like, you could go to all these people who are committing all these crimes and say, you're done now. And the response of Superman is, but that's not why I'm here. And that's the beauty behind the character of Superman, right? That's why Superman and Batman are such incredibly amazing superheroes, is because what you end up having here is a scenario where Superman's like, yeah, I mean, I could do that, right? But if he did, he'd become no different than like the crime syndicate from Earth 3. He would bend the world to his whim, right? It would be injustice Superman. We've seen that play out. Now, ultimately, it's this idea that like Supergirl kind of looks at him as a guy who pulls his punches. And the result is that she absolutely thrashes Superman. Now, she doesn't beat him within an inch of his life or anything like that, but it's made clear in no uncertain terms that she's not pulling punches. And if she chose to, she could absolutely pummel him. And that's kind of a big moment here. It's a pretty significant thing, right? Because it really kind of ties into the historical aspect that we've seen with her character, that she's more powerful than Superman. And so after he basically ends up falling at the hands of Supergirl, then you have Batman who shows up. And this is really like shady moment here, right? Like, it's Supergirl being like shady as hell, because like she makes this comment to him, you know, where he's like, you know, she's like, I'm not one of your teenagers you can control. How many of those kids have you gotten killed? And it's like, dang, man, like, dude, that's cutting deep. Drawn blood, son. That's pretty brutal. But Batman basically calls it for what it is. You're an impetulant child, right? Like, you're an impetulant child with no patience who's basically been given these godlike powers and doesn't know how to control them. Superman sees you as his cousin, and that's nice and that's cute. I see you for what you are, a danger and a threat. No one knows what direction you're going to go in, if you're going to snap and just destroy everybody. And to a degree, that's kind of true, right? Superman has had decades to prove himself, to show what he is and what he's about. Supergirl is still relatively new on the scene. She's not brand new, right? She didn't show up in like 3 years ago or anything like that, but she certainly hasn't had as much time to earn the trust of Batman in the way that Superman has. And even with Superman, it took a long time, right? Batman doesn't really trust anybody. And so as a result of that, Supergirl basically immediately targets Batman, right? She takes out the Batwing, sends that flying down to the ground, rips the door off, and is like still hiding behind your toys. You know what that reminds me of? I don't know how many of you guys remember it, but it reminds me of Original Sin, right? When basically there was this story where you ended up finding out that Bruce Banner believed that Tony Stark was the one responsible for him becoming the Incredible Hulk in the first place. And so the Hulk manifests and kind of goes on this warpath, and like Iron Man is just like fleeing for his life, right? Like, he's just like jumping from armor to armor, and then eventually gets his hands on the Hulkbuster armor, and the Incredible Hulk comes walking into the room, and he's like, always the optimist, Tony, as if you really had a chance with that suit of armor anyway, and then basically crushes the armor around Iron Man, right? It's one of the coolest moments ever. We covered that in Original Sin, and you'll find that here on the channel. I think it's actually, I don't remember if we covered it individually or if we covered it as part of the whole event, but you'll find that in the full story that you'll find down in the description. But it's kind of a cool little thing, because Batman's response is like, yeah, I don't trust you. Like, I don't know who you are. Like, you're just some kind of unknown thing that's out there. And her response is like, I could kill you if I wanted to, but I'm not, because he won't let me. Of course, her speaking about the Batman who laughs, he has his own plan for you. And so as a result, she basically dismisses him, throws him away, Superman rescues him, and then she takes off. And it's kind of a cool moment there, because what this does is it basically branches off into her own individual comic, right? It kind of continues on along the Supergirl plot threads, and will probably ultimately wrap back around into the actual Batman versus Superman line of stories at the moment. But it's a great little thing here, because what you get is essentially this ridiculously, just not really even overpowered, so much as Supergirl in her raw form, when she's not pulling any punches, when she's not holding back, and when she really is taking on Batman as Superman with the full length of her abilities. The only reason why she didn't kill these guys is because she chose not to, because I would submit here that if Supergirl so wanted to choose, like if she so chose to do it, she could kill Superman. It wouldn't be an easy thing, right? She's not gonna like punch him in the head and like shake his brain and kill him, right? It's not going to go down that fast, but she could beat him to death. And it'd be kind of a cool thing. Like it'd be interesting to see like this knockdown, drag out fight between Supergirl and Superman in terms of who would actually win here. I'm kind of curious. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace. I want to give a shout out to Jason C, Austin S, Jason S, Austin H, Philip, and Austin B. We have a lot of Austins in our Patreon, as well as Genosis916. Genosis didn't give us a first and last name, so we kind of had to roll with it. I didn't mention your all's last names. I figured you guys didn't want me to throw them out there, but I want to say thank you to you all. By the way, your Rob Corps rings should be on their way. For our Honor Guard members of the Rob Corps, for these special patrons, your custom Rob Corps rings should be on their way. They're being shipped to me. After that, I will have them shipped to you. Stay tuned, keep your eye on Patreon and your messages, and you will hear about them coming to you. Thank you.